The trauma-related behaviors theme is all about understanding trauma. Anyone who parents a child with these experiences needs to have this information for successful caregiving. Its partner theme, trauma-informed parenting, is like part 2 of this theme and will lean into parenting in this theme, but trauma-informed parenting directly targets it. This theme focuses more on understanding, which is basically the science behind the behaviors to see why trauma-informed parenting is necessary in the first place. This theme has 2 hours of foundational material. It should really come early in your series, but not before separation, grief, and loss, or attachment. We find it more helpful to layer the understanding of trauma on top of the foundation of those themes so that participants can digest the complexity of issues for children. While not all children will have experienced complex trauma, if they're being fostered or adopted, participants will need to understand that they will have experienced at least one primal loss, and we don't want to lose sight of that even though we're now talking about trauma. This theme can be heady and heavy, so we've tried to lighten it up in certain areas, like using the Instant Family movie. Try to also keep your tone a bit light and curious rather than somber and intellectual. Now let's go over the nuts and bolts in this theme. We'll start off the theme with Bruce Perry. You're going to see a lot of him in the 2 trauma themes because he's an international expert on child trauma. It'll strengthen your knowledge in this area if you go to any of his trainings or read any of his work, just so you know before you get into it. In this theme, we're going to use these videos where the material gets pretty complicated so that you don't have to teach it yourself. In these moments, your role is to be sure that participants are digesting it. So in the first video, which is called Brain Basics, the big takeaway is that children's brains and bodies react in the present as if they were experiencing trauma from the past. Because children who've experienced trauma in the present don't always meet criteria for PTSD, or they can't talk about their trauma, people don't always realize that they're often experiencing trauma triggers in their daily reactions. So it's a great video, and after you're finished with it, you'll talk about state-dependent functioning. The purpose of this content is for everyone to realize that children are not bad because of their behavior. Simply put, they're often moving through states, but those are not permanent. They're more often in states of arousal than children without experiences of trauma because their brains have been patterned this way. It's important for participants to see this because it gives them hope that things can change. We'll remind them of the cycle of attachment from the attachment theme, and it's also called the cycle of arousal, which is relatable to the trauma themes now. It's important to link the content to these other themes for reinforcement. This is what we call layered learning in the NTDC. For the purpose of this theme, we're going to call this the arousal relaxation cycle now. It's an interchangeable term, but it makes it connected to trauma. In this theme, the cycle helps us to see when needs were not met for children early on, it indeed is a traumatizing experience, and it created expectations that people would not be trustworthy. So these patterns create fear, and that's what creates the states of arousal more frequently. What children are going to need is lots of safe experiences to create new patterns. And that's when we're going to get into a video with Dr. Perry to describe state-dependent functioning. Participants should come away with a very basic understanding that the lower part of the brain is more primitive, and children will react with low reasoning when this part of the brain is triggered. When adults can help children get back to a calm state in the thinking or smarter part of the brain, then they can get back to a calm state more frequently, and they can stay up here in the thinking part of their brain. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this brain science material, notice that we're not calling this the prefrontal cortex, and we're not talking about the brainstem. We're generally using words like calm in the NTDC to describe a regulated state, just to make it more user-friendly for our participants. Remember, this might be new or confusing for our participants. So after this section, we're going to pause just so that we give everybody a chance to try to process all this material. And we're going to do this by acknowledging that children's behavior can put stress on other people and that it will impact relationships. We're also going to lighten it and switch up the pace a little bit by using a few true-false questions to be sure participants are with us, but also just to make sure that we have a moment to check in with them. We're going to return to the science, and we're going to start talking about the responses that people have when they feel under threat. The responses are normal, they're healthy, and they're protective when there's an actual threat, but they're coming from the lower, more primitive part of our brain. So we lose reasoning that comes from the higher parts of our brain. And the point of this is that when people have experienced trauma, they more likely get into or get stuck in these states from the lower parts of that brain. Now, do you see that link that we're making to earlier content in the states that we talked about? So now we're going to get into that more deeply. We're going to go into hyperarousal, and we're going to use a whiteboard, and we're going to talk about the behaviors that might go into this state of hyperarousal. And we're going to do it again with dissociation. We're going to use a whiteboard, and we're going to ask the participants behaviors that might look like dissociation. So again, we want to stay concrete and get the participants familiar with the kinds of behaviors that they might see in their homes. Then we're going to do another quick true-false quiz just to check in with them. The second half of the class starts with the identifying states activity. There's a separate instructional video on that activity, so be sure you watch it before conducting the activity. We're not going to go into it deeply here. Do know, though, that it uses an instant family clip, and if you can't use that, there's also an optional activity that's describing a scene that you can read instead if you can't use the clip. So in this activity, you're going to be using a worksheet, and participants are going to identify what state they see the different characters in. Then you're going to process that afterwards. Now, section 4 will switch the focus to the parents. The reality is that all of us get triggered, not just children. So we're going to introduce the concept of co-regulation now. That means that a person needs to be calm to calm another person down, and that's contagious. And we have this graph that shows that. We'll hit this home by discussing why it's so important for parents to be tuned in with their own reactions to be able to help children return to a calm, regulated state and learn how to stay there more frequently. The blessing and the curse is that this is a learned skill. So to reinforce this, the reflection relevance activity will end this class for participants to reflect on their own reactions to different behaviors. Key takeaways we want our participants to get in this theme. Children are acting, interacting, and reacting from the brain patterns that the traumatic experiences created. These are survival instincts that kept them safe at one time, and these brain patterns send children into more aroused states more easily, and they might stay there even longer than other children, and this is going to impact their behaviors. So all people, parents and people that they have in close contact with children, need to understand this because it is going to be impacting their relationships. The reality is that children will need patterned, repetitive responses from their parents and immediate people surrounding them to learn how to get calm and how to stay calm. And this is what's ultimately going to move them out of survival mode in their brains and their bodies. And then they won't feel so fearful in the world, which is going to really change their lives. Children will need their parents and caregivers to stay calm and regulated themselves to teach children how to do this, though. Now let's talk for a minute about some challenges you might experience in this theme. Don't get caught in the science trap of neurobiology and brain science. Some of us love that stuff, but it can get really complicated and overly interesting or confusing for people. So don't get scientific. Leave that to Bruce Perry. Stay true to facilitating the key points that you're getting from his videos. The purpose is to help participants have ahas that children's behaviors are largely out of their control, and that they will need calm parents to help them learn the skills that their brains need to have for reasonable thinking and behaviors. Don't get caught in semantics in this theme, but do make sure that participants leave knowing what behaviors resulting in hyperarousal and dissociation can look like, so that they can recognize them concretely in children and intervene as early as possible. A good example of this is the identifying states activity. So be sure to watch the instructional video on this so that you don't get tripped up in this. We want participants to realize the importance of their role by the end of this theme, and that video helps to do that. Encourage the revelations when you're processing the activity about their own reactions. And if they express strong emotions, ask them to talk in a one-on-one conversation so that you can really get at that a little bit more closely. If they don't have the revelation, make a point about that and continue to drill this, because we need for them to walk away with that point, if not in this theme, in the trauma-informed parenting theme. And if the whole class doesn't seem to get it, then make sure that you hit this harder when you get to the next trauma-informed parenting theme. The information in this theme is groundbreaking for our field. And even if it's old hat to you, it will be new to most participants, so stay engaged with the material and assume nothing. This material takes the stigma, blame, and shame out of children's behaviors, which is a beautiful thing. I would recommend never leaving this theme out of your series. Remember, we're all a product of our experiences, which is the good and the bad news. This keeps me shored up to get our parents as educated and supported as possible with this material, because when parents internalize it, they help children learn these patterns, which change the whole trajectory of their lives.